I was asked to relate some of the experiences that I was involved with at the Freedom Ride in Mississippi in 1961. This past year was the 50th anniversary, and we had a number of events associated with that, including returning to Jackson. The Freedom Rides are different from other civil rights activities. They're all part of the same movement for equal rights and equal access and things like this. But a lot of the previous movements like sit-ins, lunch counter sit-ins, bus boycotts, things like this, a beach boycott in Florida, these are local events, but the Freedom Rides, in fact, were an interstate event, and they affected the country as a whole. There was a law passed for interstate commerce that people could not discriminate on buses and public transportation, trains, planes, and things like this. And so the Congress of Racial Equality decided to test this. And they've had a couple of earlier tests, and then in 1961 in May, they started their main test into the South. And these people were mainly pacifists. Was a Fellowship of Racial Conciliation was the main impetus of this group. They came. A lot of them were associated with the University of Chicago at that area at that time in the 30s and 40s. It was a real activist kind of community, and they felt that things were going along too slowly. They felt that we had to go out, or people had to go out and challenge the establishment. Now, the NAACP and Urban League were very much against the CORE, because CORE was direct action, and CORE was agitators. They were shaking the boat, so to speak. Even the middle-class black populations in the South didn't want us there because we were challenging the status quo. And so one of the accomplishments I feel I've made in my life is I'm a professional outside agitator. But somebody has to take a stand. It's something I could never understand, even as a child, discrimination. And when I was a student, I was taking a summer class in Spanish, and one of my classmates says, "I'm going on a Freedom Ride, you want to go?" So I made the decision to go on a Freedom Ride instead of going on an archaeological expedition to New Mexico. Some people don't think that's a very good decision to volunteer for jail, but we were trained in Los Angeles before we left. We had very minimal training because we were the last official core group to go into Mississippi. So they had to fly us to New Orleans. They flew us to New Orleans. We spent the night in New Orleans, and then we got on the train at the Illinois Central Station in New Orleans. The police chief was there to make sure that we left town, and we had to take a group picture. And off to Mississippi we went. And as we got off the train in Mississippi, people were checking us off. They knew who we were when we arrived. The thing I didn't understand, and I was naive about, when I went to the South, I knew about the segregation, I knew about racial strife, I knew about hatred and lynchings and things like this. But I didn't realize what a fascist state these places were. Mississippi was divided into 3 levels of control. The top level was the Citizens Council, the White Citizens Council, which was made up of all the politicians, including U.S. senators, governors, and all the leading politicians in the state, all the people with money, the big agricultural interests and things like this. And below that, there was a Mississippi Sovereignty Commission. They had their own internal FBI. Alabama had this too. And they had informants all over the state. If people got out of line as far as crossing racial barriers and things like this, they were reported. And there were consequences to pay for their actions. And below that was the Ku Klux Klan. Now, some of these people were involved in 1 or 2 of these layers, or more than one of these layers. And so when you look back at it, it really was a scary place. I mean, it was tightly controlled. And So anyway, we got off the train. We went into the white waiting room, and we were integrated group. In all, there were only about 436 Freedom Riders, and most of them, well, a little over 50% were black, and a little under 50% were white. And most of us that were white came towards the end because there was a national call for students, and that's why more white students became involved for that. Anyway, the chief of police met us at the station and said, you all have to move on. You all have to move on. You're all under arrest. And it took about that long. We were paraded out into a paddy wagon waiting for us outside. The whole block was cordoned off by National Guard with bayonets on their rifle and police with police dogs and stuff like this. And we were taken right to the city jail. Now, the difference between Mississippi and Alabama, Mississippi didn't want the bad publicity that Alabama had with Anniston and the bus burnings and the Birmingham beatings and things like this. And so they cracked down on local troublemakers. And so we were pretty much segregated from the local population. And we were taken to the city jail. We were booked, and then we were overnight, and then we were taken in a pickup truck, kind of with a camper kind of back to the state penitentiary, Parchman Farm. Now, Parchman Farm is a very famous institution. It is notorious. It was considered the roughest and meanest prison in the South. The Mose Allison has a great song, the Parchman Farm Blues, that was very popular for a while. But in that, the word was in the South, and particularly if you were black, if you went into Parchman, you were never heard of again. The year before we got there, they finally eliminated the prison whipper. So it had some really ugly things about it, but in some ways it was very progressive. For example, the guards didn't carry guns, the trustees carried guns. And the trustees controlled all the concessions within the prison, cigarette sales, pop, and things like this. And they also made souvenirs that were sold in New Orleans to the tourists. When we entered Parchman Farm, we went into a hallway. We were taken to, first of all, to a first offenders camp because they didn't have place for us, which we were later put in the maximum security unit. And why we went to Parchman Farm is that part of the Gandhian philosophy is not only to practice nonviolence, but is also to tax the institutions, to tax the system. So CORE's, part of its job was to overcrowd, put pressure on the state to make the state spend money on taking care of these prisoners and things like this. So it was successful in that way. And in fact, there was a battle between CORE and the state of Mississippi, and the state of Mississippi obviously was able to bankrupt CORE before CORE was able to bankrupt the state of Mississippi. But it did put a lot of pressure on the local institutions. Recently here you had in Portland, you had the 99% voicing their rights and putting pressure on the institutions. Well, we hear the mayor whining today about how much it's costing the county and the city. But that's the purpose, that's the philosophy, to confront the institutions. The first offenders camp wasn't bad. It was a new facility and we had beds that were head to head and we could walk around inside and during the night and stuff like this and during the day and stretch around. We just couldn't go by the windows. And it was interesting in another way. Our night jailer, who was a local elderly man, would come in every night and would just say, I just can't understand you good white boys coming here and doing this and making this trouble. But then he'd turn on the radio and start listening to his eval in his church music, and he'd get all wired up, and within an hour he'd be screaming obscenities at me. It was an amazing metamorphosis of this individual. Every day he did this, from a nice guy to a screaming racist who would kill us on the spot if he had the chance. Then we were moved to the maximum security unit. And we were basically put on death row. And the death chamber is in the same building as the maximum security unit. We walked into, and this is for a misdemeanor offense. We walked into the building. There was a wide hallway about 15 feet across. And there was a line of prison guards, but in front of them were a line of trustees with shotguns, rifles, pistols, and stuff like this. And then we were told to strip. You kind of lose your manhood at that. When you're there naked against a shotgun and a bunch of guys who hate you, you know. So we were given a paper bag and we were told to put our clothes in a particular way. But I had big feet, so my shoes wouldn't fit. So I had to raise my hand and ask permission. And these guys with their guns looking at each other like, who is this bozo? you know, but he has to ask permission. But anyway, we were put in the maximum security 6x9 cell. We were given a pair of boxer shorts that had MSU, maximum security unit, stamped on the back, and a sleeveless T-shirt. The 6x9 cell consists of a bunk bed and a toilet and a sink. We were allowed out once a week to shower and shave, 5 minutes. And no mirror. Everybody used the same razor, and there were probably 30, 40 people using that razor. And there was no light. There was the cinder block wall across from us had a skylight in it, kind of thing. So that's the only light we got in the prison. And we kept our sanity by our belief, and our camaraderie, but through song. Every night, all the Freedom Riders, no matter where they were jailed, sang. And you sang your heart out. And that's something that drove the prison officials crazy. They couldn't understand that, but that really kept our emotions going and things like this. And so it was really quite an interesting experience, and one, you know, that once in a lifetime for myself. I would do it again, but it was just interesting to see how people were treated, because I'd heard rumors about the South, and I grew up in Chicago and in Los Angeles, and lived also in Southern Illinois. So I certainly was aware of all the problems with segregation and unequal treatment of citizens and things like this. So anyway, when we got out, they put us in the same truck and took us back to Jackson. And as we were getting close to Jackson, we started singing "We Shall Overcome" and all these freedom songs. And the driver started screaming at us. He said, "Shut up! You got to be quiet. You got to shut up." We're going, "Well, what's the problem?" And finally, he just pulled the truck off the road and stopped. And he says, and he came around the back of the truck and looked in, and the guy was shaking. I mean, he was white. He was just shaking. And he says, "Shut up! You're going to get us all killed." He says, "I've been told where to take this truck off the road and to leave you guys." So you forget how violent it was. We went to the summer when we went to the 50th anniversary and celebration of the Freedom Rides in Jackson. We went to they're starting a freedom marker program throughout the state. And one of the places was marked was Bryan's store, where Emmett Till was accused of flirting with a white woman, and then he was later taken from his grandmother's house and tortured and murdered in the night and dumped in the river. The next morning, a guy was checking his trout line, and Emmett Till's body was there and he didn't report it. They didn't find Emmett Till's body till 6 days later. And they asked the guy, why didn't you report it? And he says, why? He says, I see bodies floating down this river all the time. So I think that when I think back at that, that's the scariest thing that I experienced myself, is when this guy said, I'm supposed to take you off and dump you in the woods. And the Klan, the implication is the Klan would take care of us. And the people that followed us a couple years later in the voters' rights and community organization, that was tough. I mean, not only you have 3 people getting murdered, but the fact that they had to go to door, they were on the street all the time. We were basically taken care of, and particularly as a white person, we were taken care of. And the black riders were treated a lot rougher than we were. I met one man in Mississippi this summer who was permanently disabled because they beat him in prison a couple times because he was local. If you were from Mississippi and involved in the freedom rides or in other kind of activities, they came down on harder than you than outsiders. So it was really quite a learning experience. Anyway, we got back to Jackson, and they got us out of town as fast as they could for our own safety, and I was put on the train to Chicago and then to Los Angeles. We then returned about a month later for arraignment, all-white male jury, and we were just kind of punched through guilty, guilty, guilty. And but during that time, I had the honor to meet Medgar Evers. And I met Medgar Evers in the driveway, his driveway, where he was assassinated. Excuse me. 13 months later, and I could understand why they killed him. He was a brilliant and aggressive young attorney and believed in what he was doing. And we were in the driveway. He said, let's go in the house. They're watching us. It's not safe out here. So this past year, with the 50th anniversary, Oprah kindly invited us all to Chicago, all those who are still alive or those who still wanted to go, and put us up for a couple days in Chicago and treated us royally. And if you haven't seen the Oprah show, it's on her website, and it's the April 4th airing, and it's a very good show. Oprah had to stop several times to catch herself, like I just did myself here. 50 years later, it's still emotional. Then we went to Jackson 2 weeks later, and the community welcomed us to Jackson, and there was a lot of changes in Jackson. Not saying things are good, but there are a lot of changes. There's a black mayor, there's a black congressman, there's a black city council and state representatives, there's a black state police chief, there's a black state corrections committee head of the corrections department, and things like this. So the educated blacks that can get out of poverty are doing fine in the South. What I saw is that poverty, sometimes grinding poverty, whether you're black or white, is just as bad as it is today as it was 50 years ago. And those are the people that are stuck. The ones that are educated can move on beyond that. But we had a whole series of events. We got to go back to the prison. Greyhound provided 5 brand new Greyhound buses and 5 drivers, which were black, and took us to the prison, and we got to visit our old quarters in the prison cell. But anyway, it's something that it's important because there were only, like I said, like 436 of us, but are the reason the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. When I said the establishment was against this, the President of the United States was against us. John Kennedy wanted the freedom rides shut down. It was a blight on his administration. He felt it looked bad for his administration. His priority was international affairs, and he he didn't want this fly in the ointment. And so it was always been a struggle, and the struggle now is to get the word out, and the struggle is not over. And I hope to see you in future struggles. Thank you very much.